bootstrapping engineering hiring here in Denver. We now have 150 people, which is awesome. And most recently, I have been supporting leadership hiring for our C-level, specifically our founder and CTO, Cal Henderson. Everything in his world that is director and above is on my desk, which is challenging supporting a CTO remotely, but super interesting and a lot of fun. Full disclosure, I'm not going to talk about Slack a whole lot. I'll do some things through the lens of Slack, obviously, but you know, the things that I would hope people would come away with is just some universal truths and some ideas around how you can more effectively manage a distributed workforce. Also, some things that hopefully you can apply not just right now. I'm not going to talk about like COVID-19 a whole lot or anything like that, because I think you hear about enough of that from everybody else. So, you know, for me, it's weird. I remember telling one of my colleagues recently that I feel more connected than I have in a long time because I'm the only member of my team that sits in Denver, getting a lot more FaceTime than normal. So, you know, it's kind of a reminder that sometimes distributed work is challenging regardless of where you are. So I'm going to spend some time just talking through and acknowledging some of the realities of distributed work. Since we have a relatively small group, feel free to chime in, ask questions along the way. I'll also give you what is a little bit of a rudimentary playbook. There isn't anything in there that's like groundbreaking, but it's the things that if I had to say, hey, these are the most important tenets that I can cover in a really short amount of time. These are the things that have stuck with me after 10 years of doing this, and I'm finally just figuring out how to do it at a high level. So, yeah, it would be a lot to try to encompass everything immediately. We'll also talk a little bit about like the secret sauce of success here. Spoiler alert, there is not a secret to it. It's really just basic, like being a human, communicating well. If you have a healthy team and healthy management dynamics, working remotely, working in a distributed manner it's still challenging, but it's a lot easier. Again, there's no big secret to it. And I will leave some time for Q&A at the end. But again, if you want to interject something or ask a question along the way, I'll do my best to moderate it. It's a little easier in an actual room. So we'll start off just acknowledging and discussing some of the realities of distributed work, the challenges that come along with that. And like, I feel like this little dog a lot of times, and just trying to think about what can go horribly wrong when it comes to working with a distributed team. And I think the most obvious one is lack of visibility. People don't know who's working on what or when they're working on it. You also have what I would call a lack of accountability or lagging accountability. And the reality is that you have no choice but to trust in a distributed team. And so if somebody breaks that trust or simply isn't doing their job, you're not going to know in the same time frame that you would that you would if you were in the same office as them. Collaboration is strained. So I won't plug Slack, but we're going to talk about collaboration tools, and ways to work around that. And I think regardless of whether you have a distributed team or a team in an office, collaboration is always going to be a challenge. And it's harder to get the bulb lit. And I mean that in the sense of, if you're not sitting there and having organic conversations with your teammates, it is hard to have those kind of aha moments. I remember when I worked at Google, they told us about one of the impetus for them, aside from keeping people working for extra time in serving meals, was so that people had time to have casual conversations and kind of come up with ideas that weren't that weren't talked about in a normal work setting. And so when you're distributed, you don't have those opportunities. You have to work a lot harder to make them happen. Also, there's just the human factor, which is isolation. You know, obviously this is something that everybody is dealing with, but I think even if you were isolated on an org chart, it can still be challenging, right? You can be in the same building as people, but isolation is a very real factor that that everybody deals with when we are distributed. And the last one, which I think everyone is experiencing now, which is work-life collision. It's really hard to set boundaries. Things bleed into each other. It's I actually stole this verbiage from a colleague at work because I asked him how his work-life balance was going. He's like, "You mean collision?" So I'll address that a little later. But I think that's one of the hardest ones, and it's one of the reasons that people burn out on being distributed employees. But there are upsides to it. What could go horribly right? I think one of the obvious answers is diversity. This is the impetus for Slack even opening our office in Denver. We have offices on both coasts, and when we're sitting there going, okay, we want access to a different group of minds. What should we do? And that doesn't necessarily mean diversity along binary measures, right? It means diversity of thought and diversity of experience. We know that we're good as a company at appealing to people in the coastal tech world. Where we could use some help is reaching out to companies in the Midwest and being able to articulate Slack's value proposition to them. So that's one of the very obvious answers. The other one is cost of labor. I mean, for the same expense that you could hire 5 people in San Francisco, you could hire 6 in Denver or 10 in Chattanooga. This is probably one of the biggest reasons that growing companies look at distributing employees. Also, if you can have somebody work from home, you avoid a lot of overhead. Time zone coverage, really just from a practical standpoint, from an engineering standard, you're talking about not having to require people to carry beepers in the middle of the night to triage something. But also from a practical standpoint, if you work on the West Coast and you have a sales associate on the East Coast, you don't need to drag yourself out of bed at 5 a.m. to take an East Coast call if you're distributed. And the plus side too is it fosters an environment of autonomy and ownership. Again, you don't have a choice. You have to trust people and you have to understand that they're going to be autonomous. And for people that works well for, it is incredibly empowering. You really put people in the driver's seat of their careers. But again, it's a challenge and an opportunity. And then on the other side of that is kind of work-life balance or work-life integration, right? If you can avoid the collision, and you see, like, I'm doing this call from my home office, as many of you are, and have found ways to integrate my work life with my real life, if you will. So let's talk a little bit about the playbook and just kind of some of the best practices here. Communication, super obvious, like should be the basic, the basis for all of your work as a professional or as leaders. You need to be intentional about the ways that you communicate, and you need to establish with your teams paradigms that work for you. First and foremost is tools, right? Simplify your tools. And what I mean is, don't have things that are saved in multiple places. Agree on what goes where and what gets communicated where. If one group of your team is using Dropbox and another one is using Box, if half your team is using GChat and the other half is on Microsoft Teams, you are going to have a hot mess, especially when things start to move fast. The one thing that I've seen be successful, regardless of the tool, is having things that land all in the most logical place, and also that differentiates the way that you share both static and dynamic information. And when I say static information, I mean like an update. Hey, we signed this deal, right? Like that can be a DM. If you have to troubleshoot something on that deal, that's dynamic information. That's something that shouldn't be a DM. If you're going to have an emotional conversation, don't, for the love of whatever, do not do that via Slack or DM. Do that face to face. Tone and intent are really hard to discern in written communication. You also really want to reach the widest audience possible, and this is something that's just so critical for distributed teams. And the reason for that is because if you have an employee that's solo out in one office on the other side of the country, they might hear something via rumor instead of a direct channel. And even if that information is benign, it will carry a different weight. It will either say, hey, this decision was made in a vacuum, or it was made without my input, or whatever it might be. So you really want to take down those walled gardens where you can. And also consider the timing of who knows what and when. There's some things that might be relevant to your home base employees that are not relevant to your distributed employees, or vice versa. And also cheerlead for each other. I just think this is important to note, like really call out each other's wins, your successes, share that stuff, because going back to kind of the impediment of visibility, really making sure that you're taking the time to actually call out what's going well, who's doing a good job, and when. It matters a lot, and it helps people not feel like so much of an island. And here's a great example of like static communication within Slack. I literally just pulled this off of our client portal. So yeah, collaboration. So after I just showed you that great collaboration hub, how can you work better together? Avoid your silos. And again, this goes to reaching the widest audience possible. The way that my team does this is we do a stand-up 3 times a week for 30 minutes. Our Monday stand-up, we will talk about our goals for the week, what our project is, whatever we're working on. Wednesday is usually a lot softer. It's our like, what are you wearing today check-in. So it's totally cultural. We might do a little bit of shop talk, but it's really just like a light team touch point. And then Fridays, we talk about our progress on our goal from Monday. Helps drive accountability, helps let everybody know what's going on. Also, things happen in parallel quite a bit. So you want to be able to visualize everything, whether you're using a simple Google Doc or Kanban board or Trello or whatever. I think it's super important that everybody knows what's going on, when it's going on. It's more time consuming to constantly be pushing updates. So agreeing on like a regular cadence of updates and what information matters for updates is really important. And really be intentional about working across boundaries. If you have a distributed employee, be sure to include them in important work, give them a critical role in a project that will require them to collaborate with people. If you are working with software engineers, that's not always true. Sometimes they want to be stuck in a corner and code. But the reality is that you have to make sure that people who are distributed are given the opportunity to do work, because they are, again, going back to those aha moments, they're not going to have the organic opportunities to just leverage themselves onto a project that's going on. They might not know it's happening to begin with. And execution. So like, how do we actually get it done? Manage up. So this one's probably more for if you are a distributed employee, but I think it's true for everyone. If you are somebody who is not in the same building as your manager, you have to be willing to take the driver's seat on your career. Be proactive about establishing goals, expectations, and be really upfront about what you need. One thing that is one thing that I would really like to impart is that micromanagement doesn't work with distributed employees. The reality is that your role, if you are a manager, is to unblock impediments to somebody getting their job done. It is not to it's not to really like, nitpick the way that they do it. It's just to make sure that you're removing obstacles. And if that's not happening, that's also the role of the employee to be super vocal and proactive about, hey, here's what I'm blocked on. Here's my obstacle. This is what I need you to do to get this done, or I don't know how to do this. And you're the person who's going to help me. So it takes strong individuals to be distributed, which I think is one of the reasons that you see a lot of companies choose not to distribute employees, especially if they are a little more junior. Set expectations, like set really clear expectations along the way about what your deliverables are, what you are held accountable for, and also be decisive. Communication, because due to distribution, can be really slow. So there's a lot of times where I just go and execute on something as opposed to looking for direction or permission. And that's kind of the I regret nothing moment, where sometimes you can either, you could be working at something at midnight, right? And you've got to get it done and you just need to execute on it and you just need to go. You're not going to go and ping your manager at midnight to kind of double check your work. Sometimes you just have to be comfortable being decisive and pushing through, because at least if you're wrong, it gives you a starting point to learn from. Also, don't be afraid to get retro. Like, and I mean that in terms of run a retrospective on the things that you're working I did one of these on Monday, where I pulled together a couple of VPs and our C-level and had to run through a bunch of numbers and basically recap the last 6 months of hiring. And hey, here's how we're going to do the next 6 months without being able to actually interview in person. So constantly know where you stand and think about the things that either are contributing or inhibiting your success. And just don't be afraid to recalibrate and reiterate, especially if your team is new to distributed work. Things are going to change, the dynamics will evolve. So just be comfortable acknowledging the reality that you're going to have to change things as you go. And finally, kind of my secret sauce, again, there's no secret though. I think the most important thing is just make it personal. Be your authentic self, show up authentically. This is something that I think is hard to do professionally. It's quite a bit easier to do when you're working from home. I was talking with one of my directors the other day, and she mentioned that she's onboarding a new senior manager on her team, and she was like, yeah, I feel like we're just having deeper conversations. I'm seeing her kids run by in the background, and it's really humanizing, and so I know this authentic person that's coming in. So while you can't physically be in the room with somebody and build rapport, you are kind of learning, or we do have some potential to actually make this a little bit of a lean-in moment. The other thing too that I would impart is just communicate directly. The ideas of radical candor in particular, and feedback being a gift, being important, and table stakes to being successful with distributed work are things that I abide by. You have to be comfortable giving and receiving feedback. You have to be comfortable not sugarcoating things, and you also have to know how to do that empathetically and in a proactive way. You can't just complain without bringing a solution. You have to think about it, and it goes back to kind of that point of communicating intentionally. FaceTime really matters. It's hard to get right now, but take it when you can get it, whether it's via VC or in person. And then most importantly, like, really try to remember to have fun. I know that it's particularly tough in times like this, but even in normal circumstances, people have to remember, especially when if you're working a fast-paced startup, it's so critical to take a step back and remember what you're working for, which is everything outside of work. One of the reasons I love living in Colorado is because we work to live, not live to work. And I think that's a really important distinction and something to always kind of keep in mind here. And then the last bit that I just want to share is around creating boundaries. Set and enforce your norms with your team. Some of this is fungible based on reality and the forces of reality, particularly around hours and availability, right? Like, I sit here in Denver and I support a team on the West Coast that, even though there's only an hour of difference, executives work late hours. And so I might get a ping at 6 p.m. from one of my managers, and 6 p.m. Mountain Time, that's reasonable. At 6 p.m. Pacific Time, I'll let it slip until the next morning. Because one thing that I've learned how to do throughout the years is turn off my notifications, particularly in recruiting. The things that we do don't necessarily have lives depending on them. At least I haven't been faced with a situation that does yet. So things can wait until the next morning. And how you operate really sets the standard. There's an anecdote that I picked up from Sheryl Sandberg. It's in her book. She also talks about it in her management course that she teaches. But it's about this guy, Rob Rubin, who was the new, I think, CEO of Goldman Sachs. Walked through the trading floor one morning and mentioned, gold sounds interesting. And these traders heard this and ended up spending hundreds of millions of dollars on gold. And he didn't see it until he was auditing the books. And he asked one of his assistants why they had so much gold on hand. And they're like, that's you, sir. You told them to buy gold. And so sometimes, especially when you're distributed, because you have a limited amount of time to communicate, your communications are more impactful. If you send somebody a message at 9 p.m., it implies to them that you are also comfortable with receiving messages at 9 p.m. And so that operating standard is set. If you commit to doing something as like a throwaway, that might be the only time that you have that conversation. You might not have even committed to something. You might have just said, like Rob Rubin did, that sounds interesting. And then suddenly you're on a project that you don't have the bandwidth for and never committed to. So again, just that intentional piece of communication really matters. And if you do all these things, and if you already, which you probably already are, hopefully, you should be successful in creating a one-team mindset. I threw in these cool kids because I think one thing that happens a lot is people fall into kind of microcultures in distributed settings, where small offices will have one culture and a large office will have a different culture. Frankly, I think it's unavoidable to some level, but if you collaborate and communicate well, and you recognize that micromanagement is a trap, you also trust your distributed partners because you have no choice but to trust them. You should also promote their success and create visibility. You should create some sort of a real culture that transcends the distribution points. You can celebrate the differences and celebrate the diversity that your distributed team brings, but also have enough through lines in terms of your standard operating modes, the way that you respect and use each other's time. It should all help you be successful in what is rapidly becoming a new reality of work for all of us. So with that said, thank you all for listening to me. This is literally my second dry run. The first one I guess this is my first real run. My dry run was for my 5-year-old and a dog. So, but I'm happy to take any questions. I've also included a link to my LinkedIn if anybody wants to contact me directly, and resources from Slack HQ as well.
Andrew, that was awesome. Thank you so much. Could not tell that it was your first time actually doing it for a not 5-year-old. So
yeah, well, it was tough for me too, to be honest, because I'm like, oh, am I doing this for a recruiting audience or engineers? Or I just tried to make it as broad as possible. So I realized it was very high level, but hopefully somewhat valuable for everyone.
So one of the questions that keeps coming up at DU and on our team at Project Excite is creating a sense of community, being that we are all so dispersed. And yes, we're all working on similar things, but so much of that, community and the friendship that you make with your colleagues happens in person.
Yeah.
How do you really, and I love the idea of making it personal and getting to see each other's lives. I mean, I get comment on art and it's great. Like I love all the ability to be in each other's lives, but what sort of advice or guidance do you have for us to really build community when we're not going to see each other for we don't know how long?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I'm kind of learning this on my own, because typically the way that I would recommend doing it would be to like go and get together and take that time, right? Like if somebody's distributed, travel to them or have them travel to you as often as possible. And I know that with small companies, actually, that's a reality that might not be there even when we're not in a travel restricted world. We've been doing like Zoom happy hours, which I know everybody else has been doing too.
I'm like accidentally drinking every day. I did not intend for that to be one of the outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just I'm gonna adjust this just because I realize I'm blocking her lit up a little too much. Honestly, I don't have a great answer for that. I wish I did. I think it's an abnormal circumstance. I think this is one where, again, trying to be a little bit more authentic and vulnerable, like not to sound like this is very like Facebook culture. I used to do this culture panel for new employees, and this is like something that I would always tell them is like, be vulnerable. If you're struggling with something, find somebody to talk to. One thing I didn't put in here that I really wanted to add, and I should have, was mentorship is super, super important in these things. It can be tough to build a big team culture, but one thing that you can do is lean on mentors, either locally or within your direct team if you're distributed, so that so that you actually have a little bit more of like one-on-one, because in a setting like this with 10 people or so, you're not going to maybe want to say like, hey, I'm really struggling with my mental health today. What's everybody else doing?
Yeah.
Right. And drinking every day is, my answer too, but not necessarily the best.
Not really possible.
Yeah.
I noticed in the comment section, Maggie Red, who's from our Colorado Women's College, asked, are you seeing any difference with collaboration in this new COVID reality as compared to a more traditional dispersed workplace situation?
Yeah, I would say that projects have largely taken a backseat to our core roles. Part of that too is Slack is in the fortunate situation that we're kind of, ramping up. We're seeing much greater amounts of like users on a day-to-day basis. So, but I would say that that's one thing that we have done. And that's one thing that I think is just important in distributed teams in general, is really getting aligned on what your priorities are and what you're working on. And especially too, like, I don't know about any of y'all, but being inside my house for the last 3 weeks is like, it's tough. And so taking a little extra time out from work, dropping things off your plate, like delegating things out is totally okay. That's, I would say that's my best advice there.
That's great. Thank you.
Hey, Andrew. Thanks again. I had a question about tools. You had briefly mentioned tools, mainly around communication, but I'm wondering, besides the obvious ones like Zoom and Slack or, sort of things, if there's any other really useful tools that you've seen for distributed teams.
Yeah, I use Trello a lot with my team, also because we have like a lot of overlapping projects. Slack workflows is really nice too, just automating things. Sorry,
nice plug.
That was a shameless plug. That wasn't even in the question. I'm trying to think what else is really useful. I was thinking about incorporating one. I've seen a lot of cool L&D tools, like things that will allow you to take like live polls. Like if you have a team, you could have them all put in whatever their feedback is, and it'll pull together word clouds. So I think tools like that are really useful as well. Also, like the idea of trying to gamify things a little bit is fun or helpful.
Awesome. Sweet. Thank you.
Hey, Andrew. So I have a question about, so Project Excite has a co-working space for student entrepreneurs where students would go and hang out, work together. And so we're trying to recreate this virtual environment for the students. Do you have any insight or suggestions into what has worked well for teams in that way?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. In terms of like the actual virtual environment, honestly, I would probably point to some of the Slack for Ed projects, because they've been working a lot on that. I know that Google for Education has been doing a lot around this as well, and I imagine every other company with like a similar product has been working on it in that context. Yeah, I mean, one thing that we've done too is we try to keep as much of a state of normality as we possibly can. We also had all of our leaders basically open up all of their calendars and do things like office hours. We still are doing company all hands every couple of weeks. It's interesting via Zoom, to say the least. But really just trying to keep kind of like our standard operating procedures in place as much as possible, and keep zeroed in. But then like the flip side of it too is we also very explicitly told everybody, hey, you have a ton of flexibility right now. Just acknowledging that, like, hey, things are totally abnormal. I think the reality is like, I don't know how you create an office environment virtually, because you can't. I mean, there's no way to mirror it exactly. I think you can cut down on some of the downsides of being out of office with tools, and with kind of forced communication or intentional communication. I shouldn't say forced, or things like this where you're getting people all together in a room, virtually at least. But I think that the value proposition of having an in-office culture is pretty apparent when we're all forced to be remote as well.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, that was a big non-answer. I'm sorry.
No, that's
I
helpful.
feel like everything, it's okay. Non-answers are acceptable and expected right now. This is all,
Yeah,
White knows how to navigate this.
yeah, it's a brave new world. As much as like my whole career has been in these kind of distributed offices and supporting like a diaspora of hiring, yeah, it's still very new.
You know what I'll say though? Kanita and I did this maybe last week, sometime, week and a half ago. We had a Zoom open. We didn't have a meeting set. We just were both in the same Zoom. And so we were both just like sitting here working, and then we'd like turn and chat to each other, and
Yeah.
like we would normally do in our office. It was kind of weird, but it was also just nice to just know someone else was there and be able to like ask a question, but also just go about our day. It's kind of weird, like someone's spying on you, but it was also, I don't know, I thought it was really nice. Kanita went and like, please leave me alone, but I loved it.
A lot of I found that I've been pushing a lot of my protracted DM conversations to video chats, just like, look, let's just catch up on this live. One, because you can cover a lot more ground, and two, it's just, you know, I don't know, I crave personal connection on some level.
Yeah.
Yes, Nina, I agree. It was very nice.
Since we have a little extra time, would you mind talking about just kind of your new strategies for recruiting and how you're doing that in a travel restricted world and with all this distributed work in mind?
Yeah.
Can I add on to that question? I'm going to add on to that question. What kind of guidance would you have for our students who are seeking to enter the working world and having to go through interviews or apply for jobs when they're not going to be able to travel? So both sides of it, from the side and the applicant.
I mean, one is like, if you're not on LinkedIn, there's a lot of people sharing resources around who's like hiring and who's freezing hiring. So if you're putting together a job hunt, knowing actually where to send your resume is really useful. As far as us from a recruiting standpoint, we pretty much overnight pushed all of our interviews to be via Zoom. And for me, working with executives, it's challenging because normally if we are going to do a first round interview, like if I have a candidate in New York, I'd fly them to San Francisco, because our preference is to have every single meeting be in person. And now I have, you know, Cal and Stuart taking these calls from home. So they're doing it all via Zoom. We are, I'm prepping people for exec level presentations that are going to be done via Zoom for the first time ever. So much like this, they're going to step into a room of relative strangers, present some content that they should hopefully be experts in, and be able to articulate and answer questions. That dynamic is super different. It's hard to get signal. The way that we're approaching it is, again, I think it's just trying to be as like human and real as possible about it. I have found that from a recruiting perspective, candidates are much quicker to kind of like cut the game out right now. I think part of that is a function of also the job market literally changed overnight. It went from a candidate's market to a company's market. So the tone is very different. It's interesting though, Nina, that you bring that up, because when I finished school at DU, it was fall of 2008, and the economy crashed, I think like a month after I graduated. And that's how I got into recruiting. I had a friend who was like, hey, I think I was selling cars at the time. I was miserable. And I had a friend who had a recruiting contract at Quiznos for 3 months. And he's like, hey, you want to be a recruiter? Like, I feel like you'd be good at this. It's $10 an hour and you won't have to wear a suit to work, which you can't tell I'm not a suit guy. And so I jumped at it, and they ended up keeping me for 6 months, and yeah, my contract ended, and I went into agency, and that's actually how I ended up at Google. Somebody from Quiznos knew somebody at Google and dropped my name to them and was like, yeah, this guy, like, you know, might be worth talking to, and changed my whole career. So for me, it was just, I just took a chance. I just took a lean in moment. And when I was at Quiznos, I just like grabbed as much work as I possibly could. I was a recruiting coordinator, but I found myself quickly managing their onboarding process and figuring out ways to make onboarding cheaper, like save the company, you know, thought I saved the company money, not enough to keep my job, but yeah, but I just found, I don't know, I just kind of found a niche. And so I'd say eat what you kill. Like, find something that you're good at, find something that you like, go with the strengths-based learning approach, which is defining something strong, or defining strength as something that you actually like doing. not just something that you're good at. It worked for me. Awesome. Any other questions?
On mute, I just said, don't be shy. So if anybody's got a question, throw it out there.
Well, and two, if even if something doesn't immediately spring to mind, I am more than happy to connect with anybody offline. Like I said, I'll share the deck with Nina, and you know, I should be easy to find on LinkedIn. So yeah, don't hesitate to reach out if there's anything I can help with in the future.
Awesome.
Right.
Well, with that,
Awesome.
everybody's
Well, thank
got
y'all.
20 extra minutes in their day. So thank you guys so much for joining our first ever online workshop under Xplore, which is our incubator and now workshop series, Project Excite. So we have workshops coming up the next 2 days. We have one tomorrow on nimble marketing. It's really marketing with empathy in the face of COVID. So how to change your marketing tactics now that selling the way you've typically sold is probably got to change in order to be, you know, thoughtful and empathetic to your markets. So that'll be tomorrow afternoon. And then on Friday, we've got a 90-minute workshop with a woman named Terry Finney, she's a mental health practitioner specifically for the entrepreneurial community. So she's going to talk through sort of how to keep it together when things are so uncertain. So, and if you check out our website, projectexcite.org, and look under programs, we have about 30 workshops coming up in the next 10 weeks. So come back. Hope to see you again here soon.